Most people think poker is gambling. Cards, luck, bluffing, whatever. Wrong. The world's best poker players are cognitive athletes running memory and decision systems so advanced that casinos have literally tried to ban them for thinking too clearly. Daniel Negreanu has won over $50 million playing cards. Phil Ivey got banned from multiple casinos not for cheating, but for paying attention too well. These people are not lucky. They are not mathematically gifted savants. They trained 4 cognitive protocols that let them retain every piece of behavioral data from every player at a 9-person table across 6 hours of play. Process probability calculations in real time under deliberate psychological attack, and make optimal decisions while opponents are specifically trying to destroy their thinking. And every single one of those protocols transfers directly to how you learn, remember, retain, and perform in any high-stakes domain you care about. I studied the training methodology, the cognitive science underneath it, the neuroscience of what actually happens in a champion's brain during high-pressure performance. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why your memory and decision-making keep failing you under pressure and exactly how to fix both permanently. Chapter 1. The Behavior Ledger. Here is the first thing a poker world champion does that separates them from every recreational player at the table. They do not play cards. They play people. And playing people requires a memory system that most people have never been taught to build. Here is the problem with human memory that nobody explains honestly. Your brain does not record experience like a camera. It reconstructs experience like a detective. Every time you try to remember something, your brain reassembles fragments using inference, pattern completion, and educated guessing to fill the gaps between actual encoded data points. This reconstruction process is fast, automatic, and riddled with errors. Cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus at UC Irvine spent 40 years documenting how unreliable human memory reconstruction actually is. Eyewitness testimony, considered legally definitive for most of legal history, has been shown to be wrong in over 70% of DNA exoneration cases. The witnesses were not lying. Their reconstruction was simply wrong. Your brain fills gaps with plausible data, not accurate data. The distinction destroys memory reliability. World champion poker players solve this with what professionals call the behavior ledger, a deliberate, structured, continuously updated mental database of observed behaviors indexed by player, situation, and outcome. Not impressions, not feelings, not vibes. Specific observable behaviors linked to specific contexts and specific outcomes. Player 3 checked the flop, bet the turn, and showed down a flush draw that missed. That behavior gets filed. Player 7 raised pre-flop 3 times in a row from early position and showed down premium hands each time. That behavior gets filed. Player 1 touched their chips before folding twice. That behavior gets filed with a question mark. Possible tell, needs more data before acting on it. The behavior ledger is built on the same cognitive science principle that underlies all expert pattern recognition. Chunking plus repetition plus deliberate encoding equals retrievable expertise. Individual observations mean almost nothing in isolation. Patterns across multiple observations under varied conditions mean everything. And patterns only become visible if the individual observations were encoded deliberately rather than absorbed passively and reconstructed poorly later. Cognitive neuroscientist Wendy Suzuki at NYU confirmed this in her research on active encoding versus passive observation. Information encoded with deliberate attention and explicit structural organization shows dramatically higher retrieval accuracy under pressure than information absorbed passively in the same environment. The champion at the table is not smarter than you. They are encoding more deliberately than you. Every hand they observe is a data point consciously filed into a mental structure. Every hand you observe washes through your working memory and vanishes. Here is your version of this. Whatever domain you operate in, you need a behavior ledger. Not a vague impressionistic sense of how things work. A specific, structured, continuously updated mental database of observed patterns linked to outcomes. Sales professionals who build behavior ledgers on client responses outperform those who rely on instinct by margins that are not close. Managers who build behavior ledgers on team performance patterns make personnel decisions with accuracy that looks supernatural to observers who do not understand the mechanism. Students who build behavior ledgers on which study techniques produced which retention outcomes learn how to learn faster than anyone around them. The ledger is not complicated. After every significant observation in your domain, ask 3 questions and answer them explicitly. What specific behavior did I observe? In what specific context did I observe it? What outcome was this behavior associated with? File those 3 data points. Over weeks and months, patterns emerge from the ledger that your unstructured intuition would never have surfaced. Those patterns are your expertise, not your years of experience. The patterns you deliberately extracted from your years of experience. There is a massive difference. Chapter 2. The emotional firewall. Here is the cognitive mechanism that destroys more good decisions than any other single factor, and almost nobody talks about it with the honesty it deserves. Your emotional state at the moment of decision contaminates the decision in ways you cannot detect from the inside. This is not a weakness. It is a feature of normal human cognition that becomes catastrophic in high-stakes decision environments. Antonio Damasio at USC spent decades studying patients with damage to the brain's emotional processing centers. He expected to find that removing emotion from decision-making would improve it. The patients should be purely rational now. They should decide better. Wrong. Patients with emotional processing damage became catastrophically bad decision-makers. They could not prioritize between options. They deliberated endlessly over trivial choices. They lost the ability to make any decision at all. Emotion is not the enemy of good decisions. Undifferentiated emotion is. The difference is everything. Undifferentiated emotion means you cannot tell whether the feeling influencing your current decision is actually relevant to this situation or is bleeding over from a completely unrelated emotional event that happened earlier. Your morning argument with your partner is contaminating your afternoon investment decision. Your frustration from the previous hand is contaminating your read of the current one. Your excitement about a potential opportunity is amplifying your risk tolerance 3 standard deviations above your rational baseline. You cannot feel the contamination happening. That is what makes it dangerous. Poker world champions call this tilt. When emotional contamination reaches a threshold that measurably degrades decision quality. And the best players in the world have built what amounts to a real-time emotional monitoring system specifically to detect the onset of tilt before it becomes catastrophic. Here's how it works. At baseline, before a session begins, a champion performs what they call a state calibration. They identify their current emotional state explicitly and score its intensity on a simple 1 to 10 scale. Not to eliminate the emotion, not to suppress it, simply to establish a documented baseline. Then at regular intervals during play, they check against that baseline. Has my emotional state changed? In what direction? By how much? Is this change related to what is happening at the table, or is it imported from outside? That last question is the critical one. Imported emotional states are the ones that contaminate decisions invisibly. Table-relevant emotional states, managed correctly, can actually be useful data. They are telling you something real about the situation. Imported ones are noise masquerading as signal. Neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA showed that the simple act of labeling an emotional state in explicit language reduces its influence on decision-making by measurably reducing amygdala activation. You are not suppressing the emotion. You are moving it from the automatic processing system to the controlled processing system, where it can be evaluated rather than merely felt. Your version of this works in any high-stakes environment. Before any important decision, meeting, negotiation, or performance, run a 30-second state calibration. Name your current emotional state explicitly. Angry, anxious, excited, flat, distracted. Score the intensity. Ask whether this emotion is relevant to what you are about to do or imported from somewhere else. If imported, note it and consciously discount its influence on the upcoming decision. That 30 seconds does not make you emotionally numb. It makes you emotionally accurate. The difference between an emotion influencing your decision without your knowledge and an emotion you have acknowledged, labeled, and chosen to discount is the difference between being controlled and being in control. Hit subscribe before your emotional state changes and you forget why you were here. We stay calibrated here. Chapter 3. The probability anchor. Here is the thinking error that costs ordinary people fortunes in money, time, and opportunity every single year, and almost nobody ever identifies it correctly. You think you are evaluating probabilities. You are not. You are confusing possibility with probability, and the confusion is systematically destroying your decision quality in ways that feel rational from the inside. Something is possible if it could happen. Something is probable if it is likely to happen given the available evidence. These are completely different categories. Your brain treats them as nearly identical. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky documented this exhaustively across decades of research that eventually won a Nobel Prize. They called it the availability heuristic. Your brain estimates the probability of an event based on how easily an example comes to mind rather than on the actual base rate frequency of the event. Plane crashes are possible and extremely memorable, so your brain overestimates their probability. Car accidents are probable and extremely routine, so your brain underestimates their probability. You are more afraid of the less dangerous thing because the memorable version of it is more available to your reconstruction system. This error infects every domain where you make decisions under uncertainty. You avoid the career change because you can easily imagine it failing. You hold the bad investment because you can easily imagine it recovering. You overestimate the probability of the best-case scenario in decisions you want to succeed and overestimate the probability of the worst-case scenario in decisions you are afraid of. The mental availability of examples drives your probability estimates, not the actual base rates. World champion poker players cannot afford this error. At a poker table, every decision is a probability calculation, and every calculation is immediately tested against a financial outcome. Wrong probability estimates cost real money in real time. So they train themselves to anchor every probability estimate to explicit base rate data rather than memorable examples. Before estimating the probability that an opponent has a specific hand, a champion consults their mental database of how frequently that hand appears in this position given the betting pattern observed. Not how memorable the last time they saw it was. How frequently it actually occurs. This is called frequentist thinking, and it is a trained skill, not a natural one. Daniel Kahneman showed that even trained statisticians revert to availability heuristic thinking when under time pressure and emotional stress. The only protection is a pre-built anchoring habit that fires automatically before the intuitive estimate is generated. Your anchoring habit. Before estimating the probability of any outcome in a decision you are about to make, ask one question explicitly. What is the actual base rate of this outcome across all similar situations I know about? Not the most memorable version, the average version, the boring typical version. How often does this type of business actually succeed in year one? Not the famous success story you read about, the actual percentage. How often does this type of conversation actually produce the outcome you are hoping for? Not the ideal version, the statistical average. Anchoring to actual base rates does not make you pessimistic. It makes you accurate. And accuracy in probability estimation is worth more than any other cognitive skill in any domain where outcomes are uncertain and decisions are repeated, which is every domain that matters. Chapter 4. The Recovery Protocol. Here is the final protocol, and it is the one that separates champions who sustain elite performance across entire careers from brilliant performers who peak once and collapse. Every champion loses. Not occasionally. Regularly. Consistently. Phil Ivey, considered by many professionals to be the greatest poker player alive, has lost millions of dollars in single sessions. Daniel Negreanu has gone on documented losing streaks lasting months. The difference between a champion and a former champion is not the frequency or severity of losses. It is the speed and quality of recovery. Most people recover from failure slowly, incompletely, and in ways that leave cognitive residue that contaminates future performance. They know intellectually that the previous loss should not affect the next decision. They cannot prevent it from doing so anyway. The emotional residue of a significant failure compresses future risk tolerance, narrows attention, elevates threat detection sensitivity, and degrades creative problem-solving capacity in ways that persist long after the conscious mind believes it has moved on. This is not weakness. It is neurological. The amygdala stores high-intensity emotional experiences with particular durability specifically to protect you from repeating dangerous situations. That protection mechanism is useful in genuinely dangerous environments. In performance environments where learning from failure requires re-engaging with similar situations rather than avoiding them, it is catastrophic. World champion poker players have built explicit recovery protocols that reset the neurological residue of losses faster than any natural recovery process allows. The protocol has 3 phases, and all 3 are required. Phase 1 is physiological reset. Before analyzing what went wrong, before making any new decisions, before re-engaging with the performance environment, you reset your nervous system physically. Deep diaphragmatic breathing. 4 counts in, hold 4 counts, 6 counts out. Repeat 6 times minimum. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system and measurably reduces cortisol and norepinephrine levels within 90 seconds. Not metaphorically reduces. Measurably reduces, documented in multiple peer-reviewed studies on performance psychology. You cannot think clearly while your stress response is still running at high activation. The physiological reset is not optional. It is the prerequisite for everything else. Phase 2 is cold analysis. After the physiological reset, you analyze the loss with one specific constraint. You are only allowed to discuss what you did and what you could have done differently. Not what your opponent did, not what the cards did, not what the environment did. Your actions and your decisions only. This constraint is critical because human beings have a near-universal tendency to attribute failures to external factors and successes to internal factors. Psychologists call this the self-serving attribution bias. It protects your self-image while destroying your ability to learn from failure. The constraint breaks the attribution bias by making external factors linguistically unavailable during the analysis. If you cannot mention them, you cannot use them as explanations. What remains is accurate self-assessment, which is the only kind of assessment that produces actual improvement. Phase 3 is forward protocol setting. After the cold analysis, you produce one specific behavioral commitment for the next performance session. Not a vague, I will do better. One specific observable behavior change linked to one specific failure pattern identified in the cold analysis. I will pause for 5 seconds before responding to aggressive action rather than reacting immediately. I will not deviate from the pre-session plan during the first 30 minutes regardless of early results. One behavioral commitment. Specific. Observable. Linked directly to an identified failure mode. This forward protocol does 2 things simultaneously. It closes the cognitive loop on the failure by converting it from an unresolved emotional event into a processed learning acquisition. And it creates a specific behavioral trigger that fires during the next performance session at exactly the moment the old failure pattern would have activated. Research from psychologist Peter Gallwitzer at NYU on implementation intentions shows that specific, if thin, behavioral commitments are executed successfully over 90% of the time. Vague improvement intentions are executed successfully less than 30% of the time. The specificity is the mechanism. 3 phases. Physiological reset. Cold analysis. Forward protocol. Most people skip phase 1 because they think they are fine. They are not fine. Most people corrupt phase 2 by explaining external factors. The external factors are irrelevant. Most people produce vague commitments in phase 3 because specificity requires honest self-assessment that is uncomfortable. The discomfort is the cost of improvement. Pay it or stay where you are. Here is the problem, though. You have 4 protocols now that world champions use to perform at cognitive levels that look impossible to observers who do not understand the mechanism. The behavior ledger, the emotional firewall, the probability anchor, the recovery protocol. For tools, all backed by decades of research across cognitive science, neuroscience, behavioral economics, and performance psychology. All transferable to any domain where you need to think clearly, retain accurately, decide well, and recover fast. But here is what every champion across every domain I have ever studied confirms when you ask them what the actual foundation of their performance is. Not the techniques, not the protocols, not the systems. Sleep. Not more sleep. Optimized sleep. Because none of the above functions correctly on a degraded nervous system. The behavior ledger requires working memory capacity that sleep deprivation cuts in half. The emotional firewall requires prefrontal cortex function that sleep deprivation degrades faster than almost any other variable. The probability anchor requires deliberate analytical thinking that runs on glucose metabolism that sleep disruption destroys at the cellular level. The recovery protocol requires a nervous system that can actually reset. which requires completing full sleep cycles that most people are chronically cutting short without understanding the cognitive cost. Your brain does not just rest during sleep. It consolidates the behavior ledger entries from the day. It resets the emotional baseline that the firewall monitors. It restores the deliberate processing capacity the probability anchor depends on. Cut the sleep, and you are running all 4 protocols on a machine that is broken at the hardware level. That is why I made this video breaking down exactly how to optimize your sleep architecture from the ground up so that every cognitive system you are trying to build actually has the foundation it needs to perform. Watch it next.